The week kicked off just like any other, with the usual routine settling in place. I got up early, went through my day as I always did, and for the most part, everything seemed normal. But right from the start, I had this nagging feeling, like something was slightly off. At first, I shrugged it off, figuring maybe she was just worn out from work or had something on her mind. Still, as the days rolled by, little things about my wife's behavior started catching my attention. Nothing huge at first, just small, almost imperceptible changes, a sharper tone in her voice, a certain stiffness in the way she carried herself when we talked, and a noticeable drop in the warmth that usually defined our conversations. At first, I told myself I was reading too much into it. She mentioned she was putting together a surprise for my birthday, and I figured maybe she was just stressed, trying to make sure everything came together. I decided to let it go and give her space. But then, there were moments where her reactions felt off, too smooth, too polished. It was as if she had rehearsed what to say before I even asked. When I straight up asked if something was wrong, she waved me off without missing a beat, assuring me everything was fine and that I was worrying for no reason. But there was something about her tone, controlled, distant, almost dismissive, that stuck with me. As the week went on, her habits started shifting in ways I couldn't ignore. Normally, we spent our evenings together, either watching TV or just catching up on the day. But suddenly, she was heading out more often, tossing out vague explanations about running errands or meeting up with coworkers. At first, I took her word for it, but the more I thought about it, the more her excuses started to feel a little too convenient. One night, she came home late and told me she'd been at the mall picking out decorations for my party. It made sense on the surface, but something in the way she said it didn't sit right. The words were there, but they lacked the usual ease, like she was reciting a line she'd practiced. Then the details started stacking up. One evening, after she returned from one of her outings, I caught a faint whiff of cologne on her clothes. It wasn't strong, but it was definitely there. And it sure as hell wasn't mine. I knew every scent we had in the house, and this wasn't one of them. When I mentioned it, she brushed it off without hesitation, saying she'd bumped into a male coworker while picking up supplies. Her answer was smooth, too smooth. The kind of response that slides off the tongue when someone's already prepared for the question. And then, there was another moment that stuck with me. While helping her hang up her coat, I spotted a single, light-colored hair clinging to the fabric. Against her dark jacket, it stood out like a glaring mistake. My wife was a brunette. There was no reason a blonde hair should be on her clothing. When I pointed it out, she gave me this easy smile and said it must have come from a coworker who helped her carry some boxes. Once again, her response was quick, confident, but there was something in her expression. A smirk. Not a nervous one. The kind of smirk someone gives when they think they're pulling a fast one. I didn't press the issue right then, but from that moment on, I started paying closer attention. Her newfound ease in brushing off my questions only made my suspicions grow. Over the next couple of days, I started keeping track of everything, her tone, her excuses, her timing. She kept saying she was busy planning my birthday surprise, but something about her behavior felt too deliberate, too calculated for something that innocent. I realized there was no point in pushing her for answers, she already had them rehearsed. If something was going on, I needed proof. By the third night of that week, I had made up my mind. I picked up the phone and called an old friend. I asked him if I could borrow his car. It was a simple enough favor, nothing out of the ordinary. But in my mind, this wasn't just about borrowing a car. It was about getting closer to the truth. I told him I needed the car to run an errand out of town. He didn't ask any questions, just told me where to pick it up, and by the next morning, it was mine to use. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was different enough for my own that it wouldn't stand out right away. That was all I needed. That evening, my wife casually mentioned she had another meeting with a coworker. I acted indifferent, nodding like it was no big deal. But as soon as she walked out the door, I slipped out right behind her. Keeping my distance, I followed her car, careful not to tail too closely. She drove for a while before pulling into a small, out-of-the-way restaurant, one we'd never been to before. That alone set off alarms in my head. I parked across the street, far enough to avoid suspicion but close enough to keep an eye on her. A few minutes later, another car pulled up, and a man stepped out. The way he greeted her, warm, too warm, sent a rush of heat through me. There was familiarity there, an ease that went beyond just being coworkers. Every instinct in me screamed to get out of the car, march in there, and call her out on the spot. But I knew better. Losing my temper wouldn't do me any good. Instead, I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, and snapped a few photos. It wasn't much, but it was enough to prove that this wasn't some run-of-the-mill work meeting. Later that night, I got home to find her already in bed. Whether she was really asleep or just pretending, I couldn't say, and I didn't care to find out. Waking her up just to demand answers wouldn't get me anywhere. Instead, I sat down and went over everything I had noticed over the past week: the cologne that wasn't mine, the blonde hair that didn't belong, the sudden excuses to leave the house. Each piece on its own might not have meant much, but together, they were starting to form a bigger picture. In the following days, I carried on like nothing had changed. I stuck to my normal routine, acting as if I had no idea what was going on. At the same time, I kept a much closer eye on her. Every time she left, I noted the time. I started glancing at the receipts she brought home, listening a little more carefully to the details in her explanations, watching the way she carried herself when she thought I wasn't paying attention. I wasn't just suspicious anymore, I was collecting evidence. What stood out the most was how calm she remained through all of it. Even when I asked questions that should have made her uneasy, she never faltered. It was as if she had already run through every possible conversation in her head, prepared for any scenario. And that only made me more certain, I wasn't dealing with someone making innocent mistakes. She thought she had full control of the situation. But she was wrong. If she wanted to play games, I'd play along. But on my terms. I wasn't the kind of guy to jump to conclusions or fly off the handle. I took my time, moved carefully, thought everything through. If I was going to do this, I couldn't afford to be reckless. Every move had to be planned, every step deliberate. I wasn't just trying to catch her in a lie, I was making sure I stayed ahead of her. Day by day, I fine-tuned my approach, looking for even the smallest details. I didn't know exactly where this was going, but I knew one thing for sure: if she thought she had the upper hand, she was in for a rude awakening. I wasn't backing down until I had the full truth in front of me. Then, 5 days before my birthday, everything took a turn. By then, I had already come to terms with the fact that this had nothing to do with a birthday surprise. My wife's behavior, which had already been suspicious, was becoming impossible to ignore. The late nights, the inconsistencies, the little things that didn't add up, it was all piling up, and the weight of it was getting heavier by the day. But what I found next changed everything. It happened one evening when I walked into the kitchen and saw her laptop sitting on the table. That alone was strange. Normally, she kept it locked up tight, out of sight. But now, there it was, screen glowing softly, as if waiting for someone to take a look. And against my better judgment, I did. She was always careful about her devices, locked, out of sight, never left unattended. And yet, there it was. Open. Screen glowing faintly in the dim light. At first, I figured she must have just forgotten to close it, but something about the whole situation felt off. I moved toward the laptop cautiously, making sure not to make a sound. When I sat down in front of it, my suspicions deepened. There was no password. No lock screen. That wasn't like her at all. The sheer carelessness of it struck me as odd. Almost too odd. Like it wasn't a mistake at all. Curiosity took over. I started clicking through the open folders, scanning their contents. At first, it was all routine stuff, work documents, spreadsheets, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, one folder caught my eye. The name stood out, Property and Tower of Attorney. My heartbeat kicked up a notch. I opened the folder and found documents outlining plans to transfer ownership of our shared assets. My name was listed all over them, but the signature line? Blank. A slow, sinking feeling crept in. I kept scrolling, my eyes scanning every line, and then I saw something that stopped me cold, a timeline. A detailed schedule with a very specific date, my birthday. Words like meeting, signing, and financial arrangements popped up over and over. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't some birthday surprise. This was something planned. Calculated. I didn't waste time. I grabbed a USB drive and copied everything. I didn't know exactly what I was looking at yet, but I knew enough to understand that it was dangerous. I made sure not to leave any trace that I had seen the files, then closed the laptop like nothing had happened. As I walked away, one thing was crystal clear: this wasn't paranoia. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. Something was going on, and it wasn't innocent. Then, things got even worse. That evening, my parents showed up unannounced. That alone was strange. They rarely visited, and when they did, it was usually planned ahead of time. But this? This was different. Even stranger, they barely acknowledged me. Instead, they went straight to the living room and sat with my wife, speaking in hushed voices. I walked past the door, pretending not to notice, but then I caught a fragment of their conversation. "He can't know anything until the birthday." I stopped in my tracks. As soon as they realized I was there, the room went dead silent. My mother turned to me with a stiff, unnatural smile. "We're just discussing your gift," she said, her voice carrying a sharp edge. "Don't stick your nose where it doesn't belong." There was no warmth in her tone. No playfulness. Just an unsettling finality that made my stomach tighten. The next day, I caught them again. I walked into the kitchen just in time to see my mother quietly handing my wife a thick envelope. The way they exchanged it, quick, deliberate, like they didn't want me to see, set off every alarm in my head. I leaned against the counter, keeping my tone casual. "What's that?" My wife barely glanced at me. "Invitations for your party," she said smoothly. "Everything's under control." She smiled as she said it, but it wasn't the kind of smile that put you at ease. It was practiced. Rehearsed. Like she had an answer ready before I even asked the question. I didn't press her right then, but I knew I had to act fast. That afternoon, I bought a small recording device. If they were going to have secret conversations behind my back, I was going to hear exactly what they were saying. And that's when I got my answer. The next evening, my wife and parents sat in the living room again, deep in conversation. I let the device do its job. Later that night, when I was alone, I played the recording back. My wife's voice came through clear as day. "I'm sure he suspects nothing. Everything will be ready. If necessary, we'll make him sign it right there." Then my mother's voice followed. "He won't have a choice. We've got it all planned." I sat there, gripping the recorder so tight my knuckles turned white. There it was. Proof. This wasn't just lies. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a direct threat. My wife. My own parents. They were scheming against me. And from the way they talked, they weren't giving me an option in whatever they had planned. For a moment, the weight of it all nearly crushed me. But then, just as quickly, I forced it down. I couldn't afford to get emotional. No. If they wanted to play this game, I would play it better. This wasn't just about figuring out what they were hiding anymore. This was about beating them at their own game. If they believed I was oblivious, then I had to keep playing that role, at least until I was ready to make my move. The next day, my wife must have sensed that my attention had shifted. She left a stack of photographs on the dining table, all neatly arranged, showing her alongside her so-called colleagues at what appeared to be a party planning meeting. It was a sloppy attempt at misdirection, a weak effort to convince me that everything was as innocent as she claimed. I didn't take the bait. I didn't react, didn't so much as glance at the pictures. Acknowledging them would have given her exactly what she wanted, proof that she was getting to me. Instead, I left them sitting there, untouched. Her attempt to cover her tracks only proved one thing: she was feeling the pressure. With the evidence I had already gathered, I knew I couldn't handle this alone. I needed someone I could trust. That's when I reached out to an old friend, one of the few people I knew had my back no matter what. I showed him the documents I had copied and laid out everything I had pieced together so far. We started digging. It didn't take long to find out more about the man I had seen with my wife. He wasn't just some coworker. He had a reputation, one filled with financial scams, manipulation, and deception. The kind of guy who didn't just lie, but built entire schemes around it. The puzzle pieces were finally coming together. This man wasn't just in her life, he was at the center of whatever was unfolding. I couldn't afford a single misstep. From here on out, every move had to be calculated, every decision made with precision. The stakes were even higher than I had anticipated, and they were betting on my ignorance. But if they thought I was just going to sit back and let them take everything from me, they were dead wrong. Now, it was my turn to plan. That night, as I sat in silence, replaying everything in my mind, one thing became painfully clear: my home, my stability, my entire future was on the line. This wasn't just about suspicions anymore. It wasn't about paranoia. This was about survival. I needed a response just as cold and calculated as their scheme. If I wanted to win this, I had to be as meticulous as they were, maybe even more so. They had underestimated me. That was their first mistake. From this point forward, every move I made would be about turning the tables. They thought they were in control, but they had no idea what was coming. The game had changed, and now, I was playing by my own rules. The stakes couldn't be higher, and failure wasn't an option. I would plan carefully, and when the moment was right, I would strike. There was no room for hesitation. Everything was at risk. And I intended to protect what was mine. 3 days until my birthday. The tension in the house was almost suffocating. By now, I had more than enough proof to confirm my suspicions. But knowing the truth wasn't enough. If I didn't act soon, I risked losing everything: my home, my dignity, and possibly even my safety. Every word my wife spoke felt measured. Every move she made seemed calculated. I had spent the past week observing. Now, it was time to shift gears. Watching wasn't enough anymore. It was time to act. The first red flag of the day came early that morning. My wife casually announced that she needed to head into the city to finalize last-minute preparations for my birthday. But her tone gave her away: her voice was just a little too smooth, her smile just a little too polished. It was almost mocking, as if she was enjoying the fact that she was keeping something from me. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. Let her think she still had the upper hand. But inside? I was seething. By this point, it was painfully obvious that her so-called birthday plans had nothing to do with celebrating me. This was about him. About their scheme. About whatever they were setting up behind my back. The second she walked out that door, I got to work. I made a few calls to the people I trusted the most, my closest friends. We needed to meet, and we needed to do it somewhere private. Mike's garage was the perfect place. No one would think twice about a few guys meeting up there, and more importantly, it was out of sight. I had all the pieces in front of me. Now, it was time to put them together. At Mike's garage, I laid everything out. The files I had pulled from her laptop. The recordings of her conversations with my mother. The photos I had taken of her secret meetings. Piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together, and the picture wasn't pretty. Mike, who had a solid background in legal matters, went through the documents carefully. His face darkened as he flipped through them. "These are forged," he said, shaking his head. "But they're made to look official. If they pressure you into signing, they could still hold up in court under the right conditions." I had already suspected as much, but hearing it from him made it real. This wasn't just my wife's doing, she had help. And not just from her lover. My own parents might have been involved. That settled it. We needed more information. Jack volunteered to follow my wife and track her movements. Using a car that wouldn't raise suspicion, he tailed her to an office building in the city. From his vantage point, he watched as she met with the same man I had photographed earlier that week. They entered the building together. Almost an hour later, they walked out, each carrying a folder. Jack snapped a few quick photos before they split up and drove off in different directions. The pictures, combined with the evidence I had already gathered, proved beyond a doubt that this man wasn't just some harmless coworker, he was deeply involved in whatever she was planning. While Jack was keeping an eye on her, I stayed home and did some digging of my own. I combed through her belongings carefully, making sure not to leave any sign that I had been looking. In the pocket of her coat, I found a small slip of paper with a phone number and an address scrawled on it. I looked up the address. It belonged to a small office in the city's business district. I knew I couldn't just show up there unprepared, so I reached out to a private investigator I had worked with before. He was good, discreet, and fast. A few hours later, he called me back with a report. The office was rented under the name of my wife's lover. That was it. I no longer had suspicions, I had facts. She knew I was on to her. By this point, my wife must have sensed something was off. Maybe I was acting differently, maybe I was a little too quiet, a little too careful. Whatever the case, she decided to flip the script. The next day, I found a large envelope in my car. Inside? A stack of photos. Me, with an unfamiliar woman. It was an obvious attempt at manipulation, her trying to plant doubt in my mind, to make me feel guilty or question myself. I didn't take the bait. Instead of reacting, I calmly took my own photos of the contents and sent them to Mike and Jack. Within minutes, they confirmed what I already knew. The images were doctored. Sloppy editing, poor lighting, bad cutouts, it was all fake, a rushed attempt to turn the tables. Her desperation only strengthened my resolve. I refused to let her get ahead of me. To stay one step ahead, I took even more precautions. That night, I installed a small recording device in our bedroom. If she was going to keep having secret conversations, I was going to hear them. I didn't have to wait long. The smoking gun. Late that night, I played back the recording. Her voice came through crystal clear. "He has to sign them," she said. Her tone was cold, emotionless. Then his voice followed. "If he resists, we'll force his hand. Don't worry," he added. "We'll have everything in place." I sat there, gripping the recorder, my pulse pounding in my ears. There it was. The confirmation I had been waiting for. They weren't just planning to deceive me. They were going to corner me, pressure me into signing away everything. I wasted no time. The next morning, I called my friends again. We met at Mike's garage, the place that had become our war room. I played them the recording, and as they listened, their faces hardened. We all knew what this meant. Confronting her now was too risky. If she realized how much I knew, she would shift tactics. We had to keep gathering evidence, keep building our case. Jack suggested we increase surveillance, watch her movements even more closely. Mike started preparing for legal action, in case things escalated. And we made one more move, one that would put us in control of the situation. We reached out to a trusted attorney. Someone who could help us navigate whatever legal traps they were planning. This wasn't just a game anymore. This was war. Every move we made was deliberate, every decision calculated with precision. There was no room for hesitation, one misstep, and everything could fall apart. As the hours passed, the full weight of the situation settled on me. This wasn't just my wife acting alone. She had a team, her lover, my own parents, people who had clearly done this before. They were experienced, methodical, and confident in their ability to manipulate me. But they had underestimated me. They assumed I would stay passive, that I would trust blindly, that I wouldn't question what was happening until it was too late. That was their biggest mistake. If I had one advantage, it was my ability to stay calm, to think instead of react. Even under pressure, I wasn't going to break. I decided to take one more step, one that could change everything. I reached out to the private investigator again and asked him to dig even deeper into my wife's lover. Within a day, he sent me a comprehensive report. What I found out didn't just confirm my suspicions, it gave me a weapon to use against them. This man wasn't just a liar. He had a history of financial fraud, conning people out of their money through shady business deals, falsified documents, and coercion. He was a manipulator, someone who knew exactly how to push people into signing away their assets before disappearing. He wasn't just a side piece in my wife's life, he was the mastermind behind whatever they were planning. That was all I needed to know. 3 days until my birthday. By now, my plan was clear. Gather evidence. Keep her off guard. Prepare for the confrontation. My friends and I worked together to cover every angle. We weren't just reacting anymore, we were taking control. The tension in the house was unbearable, but I refused to let it show. Every word I spoke, every move I made, was carefully measured. I had come too far to falter now. The game wasn't over, and if they thought they still had the upper hand, they were in for a rude awakening. One day until my birthday. The atmosphere in the house had changed. I could feel it. By now, I had gathered enough evidence to fully understand the scope of their plan. My wife, her lover, and even my own parents weren't just trying to blindside me, they had been carefully orchestrating this for weeks. Their plan was simple. They would use my birthday as a distraction. With the chaos of the event, the guests, and the pressure of the moment, they assumed I would be vulnerable, easier to manipulate. Their goal? To corner me, to force my hand into signing away my assets. They thought they had me backed into a wall. But they were wrong. I wasn't just ready to stop them, I was going to make them regret even trying. The final meeting. Early that morning, I gathered my closest friends at my house. This wasn't just a casual discussion, this was a war room. We spread everything out on the table, the files from my wife's laptop, the photos of her meetings with her lover, the audio recordings of her conversations with my mother and their accomplice. Every single piece of evidence we had collected. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was proof. And more importantly, it was ammunition. I looked each of my friends in the eye and laid it out. Tomorrow, they'll try to corner me, I said, my voice calm and steady. They think I'm in the dark, and that's our advantage. But I want us to be ready for anything. If they try to force my hand, we need to be prepared to completely destroy their plan. One by one, my friends nodded. They understood the gravity of what was happening. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about standing up to deception and manipulation. Locking down the plan. The first step. Document everything. We set up hidden cameras and audio equipment in the living room, the most likely place for the confrontation to happen. If they were going to try and manipulate me, they wouldn't just fail, I would have proof of their crime. Mike, with his legal background, pushed for an extra layer of protection. "We need a lawyer on standby," he said. "If they try to trap you into something, we need to make sure you're covered from every angle." And he was right. So we called one. A trusted attorney who could advise us on what to do if things escalated. Now, I was ready. They had spent weeks planning how to take everything from me. And in one night, I was going to take it all back, the final preparations. "We need to anticipate every move," Mike said firmly. "If they try to confuse you or threaten you, stay calm. Stick to the facts, and don't let them see any weakness." His words rang true. This wasn't just about catching them, it was about outplaying them. If I let emotion take over, they'd use it against me. But if I stayed composed, if I stuck to what I knew, they wouldn't stand a chance. I trusted Mike to keep us grounded. His legal background made him an asset, and his ability to think ahead would be crucial. The next step was gathering even more evidence to strengthen our case. That afternoon, I made a bold move. With one of my friends backing me up, I went to the office building where my wife's lover was based. We had a plan, a believable excuse. Posing as potential tenants, we arranged to meet with the landlord, which gave us just enough access to get inside. Once there, we didn't need long to find what we were looking for. Inside his office, we came across draft documents, blueprints of their entire scheme. They detailed financial transfers, asset allocations, and a post-signing strategy for dividing everything once the deal was sealed. It was all there. The evidence we needed to bury them. I took pictures of every page, making sure no detail was left out. This wasn't just proof of betrayal, this was proof of fraud. Their scheme was still in motion. While I was securing our final piece of evidence, my wife was busy playing her role. That morning, she had left the house with her usual carefully rehearsed smile, telling me she needed to make last-minute arrangements with the catering service for my birthday party. She spoke casually, as if the day ahead was nothing special. I nodded, pretending to believe her. But I knew exactly where she was going. Jack followed her as planned. He tailed her to a small cafe, where she met up with her lover yet again. They spoke in hushed tones, exchanged envelopes, then parted ways. Jack captured everything. The photos were damning. If there was ever any doubt that their plan was still active, this erased it. They weren't just finishing preparations, they were finalizing their betrayal. Time to rattle her. The third part of our strategy was simple: bait her into making a mistake. That evening, before she got home, I left a folder on my desk, right where she'd see it. Inside were fake documents, carefully designed to look like I was preparing a counterattack. They weren't real, but they were just convincing enough to make her panic. And it worked. The moment she walked in, I saw her eyes land on the folder. Her face flashed with panic, just for a second, before she forced herself to stay calm. She didn't mention it. Didn't ask about it. But her behavior changed. She was rattled. That was exactly what I wanted. The final plan. That night, my team and I finalized our strategy. If they try to force you into signing, we go public with everything, Mike said. Expose them. Make it clear their plan is dead in the water. I nodded. And if they push harder? Mike didn't hesitate. We bring in law enforcement. It was the final layer of security. If they tried to intimidate me into signing, if they pushed too far, they'd have to face real consequences. There was no more room for hesitation. As the night stretched on, I reviewed everything one last time. The photos. The recordings. The documents. It was a bulletproof case. My wife, her lover, my parents, they had played their game thinking I wouldn't see through it. But they had miscalculated. The calm before the storm. Jack checked the placement of the cameras, ensuring they would capture every detail of the confrontation. Mike coordinated with the lawyer, making sure we had legal protection if things got ugly. And me? I prepared myself. I ran through their likely moves in my head, rehearsing my responses. There was no room for hesitation. No room for mistakes. This wasn't just about protecting my assets. This was about reclaiming my life. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but think about how far things had spiraled. The betrayal. The lies. The calculated deception. It should have felt surreal. But all I felt was cold resolve. Tomorrow wouldn't be a celebration. Tomorrow was a battle. And I was ready. I wasn't the victim in their story. I was the one who would write its ending. Morning would bring the culmination of everything they had planned, but it would also bring something they never saw coming, my retaliation. Every move they made would be countered. Every lie they told would be exposed. I had played my part well, the oblivious husband, too blind to see what was happening under his own roof. But now? Now it was my turn to act. With everything in place, a calm determination settled over me. The time for preparation was over. The time for action had arrived. Tomorrow, they would try to corner me. But instead, they would find themselves trapped. I was ready. I was ready to face their betrayal head-on and deliver the blow they never expected. The morning of the reckoning. One day remained. The house carried an eerie calm, a deceptive normalcy. On the surface, it looked like any other birthday. My wife moved about with her usual, carefully rehearsed smile, acting as if everything was just another routine celebration. Relatives bustled around, pretending to make preparations for the evening's supposed festivities. And me? I played my role perfectly. Outwardly calm. Unbothered. Clueless. But inside, my resolve burned like fire. I knew the truth. This wasn't a celebration. This was a war. Early that morning, I took my final precautions. I discreetly installed a miniature hidden camera in the living room, the most likely stage for whatever my wife and her conspirators had planned. It was impossible to detect. I tested it, making sure it was recording properly. This was my insurance policy, the last safeguard in case things didn't go as expected. As the time drew near, I positioned myself in the living room, deliberately choosing a seat where I could see everyone who entered. And then, finally, she showed her true colors. The betrayal. It happened in an instant. Two men, ones I hadn't noticed right away, moved in from behind. Before I could react, my arms were yanked back, plastic ties cutting into my wrists. An ambush. Quick. Calculated. I was trapped. Cornered exactly how they wanted me. But I didn't panic. I didn't fight. I refused to give them the satisfaction. My wife stepped forward, her expression shifting into one of cold triumph. "Well, dear," she cooed, her voice laced with mock sweetness, "today you have a choice. Either you sign everything over to me, or you don't leave this house alive." She stared down at me, waiting for a reaction. I gave her nothing. Her eyes darkened. Her voice sharpened, words laced with bitterness and disdain. "I've had enough of you." She sneered. "You have the money, the houses, but you don't even know how to use them." She flicked her hand toward the man standing beside her, her lover, Jack. "Now, they belong to me and Jack." Jack smirked, his confidence disgusting, like he had already won. I scanned the room, my gaze slowly moving from face to face. And that's when I saw something that cut deeper than anything else that had happened so far. My parents. They stood off to the side, silent until now. And when they finally spoke, they didn't defend me. They didn't stop her. They sided with her. My father's voice was cold. Emotionless. "It's for the best, son," he said, eyes refusing to meet mine. "You've been too rigid. This is your punishment." My mother nodded beside him. No hesitation. No remorse. The weight of their betrayal hit harder than anything else. My wife's deception? I had expected that. But my own parents? They weren't just allowing this. They were part of it. I had been prepared for almost everything. But nothing could have prepared me for that. The ultimate betrayal. As if their words weren't enough, my wife decided to take things even further. She didn't just want to betray me, she wanted to break me completely. With a slow, deliberate stride, she walked over to her lover. And in front of everyone in the room, including my own parents, she put on a disgusting display of infidelity. It wasn't just about passion. It was a power move. A final, twisted way to humiliate me, to strip away any last shred of dignity I had left. And what was worse? The indifference of those around me. No gasps. No shock. No one turning away in discomfort. Not even my own parents. They just watched. As if this was just another step in their plan. As if this was the moment they had been waiting for. But then, the tables turned. Justice arrives. What they didn't know was that I wasn't alone. My friends had been monitoring the situation from a distance. When I failed to check in, they knew something was wrong. They didn't hesitate. They called the police, giving them the full story and making sure there was no room for doubt. And the timing? Couldn't have been more perfect. Just as my wife's obscene performance reached its peak, the police stormed into the house. Everything shifted in an instant. Officers moved with precision, weapons drawn, ordering everyone to the ground. They secured the scene, restraining my wife, her lover, my parents, even the men they had hired to hold me down. The house erupted into chaos. Shouts. Protests. Scrambling excuses. But the police weren't interested in explanations. They were there to do their job. And they did it without hesitation. One officer approached me, cutting the ties from my wrists. I stood up slowly, flexing my hands, my gaze sweeping over the wreckage of their failed scheme. Without a word, I walked over to the hidden camera, reached behind the shelf, and retrieved the recording device. I turned to the officer, handing it over. "This should explain everything." My voice was steady. Cold. The officer took it, nodding, already understanding the weight of what I had just given him. There was nothing left to say. The evidence spoke for itself. The end of the lie. The police wasted no time gathering the conspirators. One by one, they were escorted out of my house. Some struggled, some shouted, some cursed my name. But I ignored them all. Even my wife's piercing screams of rage as they dragged her out meant nothing to me. She had played her game. She had lost. And now, the only thing left for her was the consequences. The house, once filled with tension and deceit, suddenly felt empty. But that emptiness? It was freeing. The aftermath. I made my way upstairs to my bedroom. For the first time in what felt like forever, I sat down, letting out a slow, measured breath. The events of the day played back in my mind, flashing like a montage I barely recognized. This hadn't been a birthday. This had been the end of a chapter one hadn't even realized I was living. My family. My marriage. The life I thought I had built. Gone. Shattered by greed. By betrayal. By people who had convinced themselves I would never see through them. But as I sat there, something unexpected settled over me. Strength. They had tried to break me. To take everything I had built. To strip me of my dignity, my future, my very identity. But I was still standing. I had seen through their lies. Uncovered their schemes. And I had won. This wasn't just survival. This was a rebirth. The beginning of something new. The house was empty now, a hollow shell of what it had once been. But I knew something with absolute certainty. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't living under an illusion. I wasn't clinging to a false sense of security, or holding on to relationships built on lies. I was free. And now? I was ready to rebuild. Tomorrow would come. And when it did, I would be ready to move forward, on my terms. A new chapter. I owed no apologies, to anyone. Not for what I had endured. Not for how I had fought back. From this moment forward, my life would be different. I would move with the same cold precision that had carried me through the battle. Every betrayal would serve as a reminder. A reminder of what happens when you underestimate a man willing to fight back. What lay ahead weren't just new beginnings. They were new chapters. And in these chapters, I would move smarter. Stronger. With a decisiveness I had never known before. Severing the past. Months passed since that day. The day that split my life into two. Before. And after. But I didn't waste a second drowning in the wreckage they left behind. I did what I do best. I calculated. I executed. There was no room for hesitation. No room for emotion. Everything I did from that point forward had a purpose, to sever every last tie to the toxic past that had nearly destroyed me. The first step. Ending my marriage. Taking everything back. I didn't delay. I hired the best divorce attorney I could find. Someone ruthless. Someone who didn't just win cases, he buried his opponents. I gave him everything, video recordings, documents, witness testimony. And in court, the truth crushed every lie she tried to spin. My wife screamed, cried, played the victim. She tried to paint me as the villain. But her theatrics fell apart the second the evidence spoke for itself. The judge didn't hesitate. Divorce granted. Assets untouched. She got nothing. And her lover? Fraud. Extortion. Both of them sentenced to prison. Watching their smug confidence shatter as the verdict was read was a moment I would never forget. The final cut. But the real pain didn't come from my wife. It came from them. My parents. Standing in court, watching them avoid my gaze, I felt a wound deeper than anything she had inflicted. They mumbled excuses. We only wanted to help the family. Their words meant nothing. The court released me from any financial obligations toward them. And I did what I had been thinking about for months. I stopped paying their mortgage. Once, I had bought that house out of gratitude. Now, it was their burden to bear. Our final conversation was short. My mother pleaded, "You don't have to do this." I looked her in the eyes. "You made your choice." And I walked away. I changed my number. Cut off all contact. The ones who stayed. The only people who mattered now were the ones who had been by my side when it counted. My friends, the ones who had stood with me, fought with me. They weren't just friends anymore. They were family. Because loyalty isn't given. It's earned. And they had earned mine. Together, we celebrated, not just in court, but in life itself. It wasn't just about escaping the past. It was about embracing the future. Rebuilding me. Free from betrayal, free from everything that had once chained me down, I turned my full focus toward rebuilding. I threw myself into my work with a renewed sense of purpose. I found time for hobbies I had long neglected, things that reminded me of the man I was before the lies. And I let new people into my life. Fresh perspectives. New opportunities. Slowly but surely, I took control of my destiny again. Then came the biggest step. Selling the house. The place where so many painful memories had been made. I left the past behind. Bought a new place. A new city. Far from the shadows of betrayal. Far from them. A clean slate. And for the first time in a long time, I was finally free. The final step forward. Leaving that house behind was more than just a move, it was a statement. It was the closing of a door that had been open for far too long, a final break from everything that had tried to hold me down. And when I looked back, I didn't see pain. I saw lessons. Lessons that had shaped me, sharpened me, made me stronger than I ever was before. The power of trusting myself. If there was one thing I took away from everything that had happened, it was this. Trust yourself. There had been times before when I had hesitated, when I had second-guessed my instincts. That version of me? Gone. I no longer needed validation from anyone. I didn't fear loss because I understood something now. Sometimes losing is the best thing that can happen to you. Every move I made was now backed by confidence and clarity. That, in itself, was a victory. Turning scars into strength. Of course, the betrayal I had endured left scars. But instead of letting them weigh me down, I used them as fuel. Every scar was a reminder of what I had survived, of what I had overcome. I didn't waste time mourning what was lost. Because the truth was, I had gained far more than I had ever lost. My life now? Richer. More vibrant. More real. This wasn't just a new chapter. It was an entirely new book. And for the first time in a long time, I was the one writing it. They had failed. My wife had tried to break me. She had tried to take everything I had built and burn it to the ground. But in the end, she only made me stronger. Her betrayal had taught me resilience. It had shown me the importance of protecting what's mine. Now, she and her lover could rot in their prison cells, reflecting on their choices. Their story was over. Mine? It was just beginning. Cutting the last ties. Even my parents, as much as their betrayal had wounded me, had taught me something valuable. Boundaries. The absolute necessity of knowing when to walk away from people who do not have your best interests at heart. Letting go of them wasn't easy. But it was necessary. I had given them every chance to redeem themselves, and they squandered it. Cutting them out of my life wasn't just a decision. It was the final step in reclaiming my future. The real victory. Winning in court had been satisfying. Watching those who had betrayed me face consequences had been gratifying. But the real victory was in the life I had built for myself after. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of the past. I had reinvented myself. And the man I had become? I was damn proud of him. Stronger. Smarter. Sharper. Every morning, I woke up with purpose. With a sense of clarity and direction I hadn't felt in a long time. There was no space in my life for regret. Regret was a luxury I couldn't afford. And honestly, I didn't want it. Everything that had happened, the pain, the deception, the loss, had led me here. It had refined me. And in the process, it had forged me into the best version of myself. No longer just surviving, thriving. Now, months after the dust had settled, I felt nothing but gratitude. Not for them. Not for what they did. But for the strength I found within myself because of it. I was no longer the man who had been blindsided by betrayal. I was the man who had faced it, fought it, and won. My life was mine again. And I intended to live it fully, boldly, unapologetically. Because this wasn't just a legal victory. This was a victory over everything that had tried to destroy me. And I had come out on top.